What's up, human beings? Today is Friday the 13th, and obviously that means I'm here to talk about
Friday the 13th.
And if it's not Friday the 13th, that means that, like everything else in my life, I left this to the last minute and didn't have enough time to finish. Friday the 13th is the second highest grossing horror franchise in the world. It has 12 movies and an enormous pop culture presence. Most people can easily recognize Jason's iconic hockey mask, but how many people have actually seen the movies? And I don't just mean one, because, as we'll see, it really depends on which one you see, and you really need to see more than one. The Friday the 13th movies, which I'll call the Friday movies from here on out to avoid saying the 13th every time, are a mixed bag. I'll be frank, none of these movies are cinematic masterpieces, in my opinion, but some of them get closer than you might expect. Despite that, they're entertaining as all heck, even if they are bad in the good kind of way. So I thought it would be worth going over the Friday franchise, to look at the good, the bad, and the, Oh my god! Oh, and also, spoiler and gore alert. As if that wasn't already obvious, you've been warned. Slasher movies like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and especially Halloween influenced the first Friday movie. Released in 1980, Part 1 is different from what most people would expect from a Friday movie. Jason isn't the killer, and all of the kills are seen from the killer's point of view. This being the first movie in the franchise, it was before the Friday movies really had an identity, which means the movie felt more like a generic slasher. And speaking of genre, Friday Part 1, like most horror movies in the 1980s, relied on the audiences knowing their tropes. This isn't to say that the movie is entirely predictable. Don't worry, we'll get to that. But it did mean there was a connection between the movie and the audience through familiar signs of tension and terror. Moviegoers knew when they were being told that a frightening thing was about to happen. Things like unsettling music or silence, sudden camera movements, or sudden shifts in tone. These let the audience know something frightening was about to happen. And the state of expecting that frightening thing is tension. Horror movies have to effectively build and release tension. If it builds too much tension, or never releases it, it can feel monotonous and you kind of get numb to it. If it doesn't build enough tension, or releases it too often, it can stop being scary and you might not feel invested. Time for some backstory. Friday Part 1 tells the story of Camp Crystal Lake. In 1957, Pamela Voorhees worked at Camp Crystal Lake as a cook, and her son attended as a camper. But her son
wasn't a very good swimmer.
And one day, he ended up in the lake. He started to drown, but because the counselors were too busy smoking drugs and having sex, they didn't notice the commotion. Pamela's son ended up drowning because of the inattentive counselors. The following year, in 1958, the night before the camp was set to open to the public, 2 counselors were found brutally murdered. The camp was shut down for more than 2 decades. But 21 years later, in 1979, is where we start in Friday Part 1. We watch a volunteer counselor hitch a ride to the camp, being told foreboding stories by the locals. We also watch the other counselors show up in various means, but with a familiar eagerness for drug smoking and sex having. This is essentially where I get my idea for cinematic entrapment and the bad camper from. Cinematic entrapment is the term I use for when a movie puts the protagonist, and by extension, the audience, in obvious situations of peril. And the bad camper is the kind of protagonist that does everything the audience knows not to do. And I call them this because of Friday the 13th. The bad camper is in a movie where you know that the drugs and the sex mean the death, and yet you're stuck watching them make those mistakes. So we watch as all the counselors but one are killed, and just as we think the sole survivor is going to make it, plot twist, it's Pamela Voorhees, and she's been the killer the whole time. Mrs. Voorhees and the final girl have a tussle, and poor old Pam ends up having her head chopped off with a machete. The final girl floats herself out onto the middle of the lake for safety, and just as we think the movie is over, another twist. And then another twist.
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
And then
another one.
So there you go. That's the movie that started it all. Friday Part 1 introduced the iconic, but had relatively tame kills. I feel like it was worth giving special attention to Part 1 because it sets the precedent for everything to come. Now, I know there's a lot of fan theories and behind-the-scenes explanation, but I'm just gonna say this. Basically, Pamela Voorhees' vengeful spirit reanimated Jason's body from the lake, and Jason started killing to get revenge for his mom's death, who was killing to get revenge for his death. So, there you go. The following year, Friday Part 2 would hit theaters. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a Jason. He's slow. He's got a bag over his head. Kinda sucks, to be honest. But we've got a Jason. We've also got pretty well the same everything else, unfortunately. The only notable part, really, is some backstory towards the end. One of the counselors finds a shrine of Mrs. Voorhees in Jason's shack. And, oh look, Jason's a fan of collectibles too. Being a child psychology major, she's able to disguise herself as Mrs. Voorhees and tap into Jason's childhood trauma, distracting him just long enough to get the upper hand in the fight. But come on, Jason has 10 more movies, so he just busts through the window like some hillbilly golem for another twist ending. The following year, again, we get Friday Part 3, or specifically, Friday 3D. And it's, do you remember how I said that some of them are bad in the good kind of way? This movie is way more of a gory comedy than it is a horror movie, especially by 2020 standards. The movie is another familiar formula.
Sex, sex, sex. You guys are getting boring, you know that?
The only thing that Friday 3D did for us is it gave Jason his hockey mask. And Jason is a force to be reckoned with in this one, so I'll give it that. 2 years later, and we get Friday Part 4. The final chapter. This movie kicks ass. It's awesome. By this point, it's obvious that all the Friday movies are going to follow the same basic setup. Unwitting counselors head to Camp Crystal Lake for drugs and sex, and Jason kills them.
So I'm editing right now, and I realize that parts of what I say here are wrong, so I just wanted to go back and correct the record. The victims, so to speak, of Friday Part 4 aren't actually camp counselors. It's just a group of teenagers who went to Crystal Lake to party for a few days. However, my point that there was a certain formula that Friday movies started to follow is still true. It's still a bunch of teenagers that go to Crystal Lake to have sex and do drugs, and they end up getting killed. It's just that these specific teenagers weren't also camp counselors, so just wanted to clarify.
But Part 4 sets itself apart in several ways. Firstly, the practical effects and gore are seriously improved. They look awesome. Second, Jason is a badass. I'm pretty sure most horror fans by this point were just on Jason's side, rooting for him to kill these insufferable counselors. Thirdly, the acting is better for the most part, but if you're into cringe, check this out. Friday Part 4 ends with another instance of Jason being hypnotized by some psychoanalysis mysticism, and a really gruesome shot of his head sliding down his machete to the floor. Damn. So there you go. That was supposed to be the end of Jason. The next year, Friday Part 5, A New Beginning, came out. And I'll tell you something. It's not a good one. Part 5 was meant to be the first in a new trilogy of Friday movies where Jason wasn't the killer, and nobody liked it. Every Friday movie after this one, until the 11th installment, received half the box office returns as all of the ones before. People wanted to see Jason, and as soon as they didn't, they were just done with the series. A New Beginning was also increasingly sexual, not that that stops here, unfortunately, and it also had a really tone-deaf representation of mental illness. So, unless you're keen on seeing every Friday movie, you can skip this one. Because the following year, we get Friday Part 6, Jason Lives. I find this so funny. They planned to have 2 more movies where Jason isn't the killer, but the backlash was so fierce that within 1 year, they pivoted back to continuing Jason's story. And it's a good thing they did, because, let me tell you, this movie is wicked. Aside from Part 1, Part 6 is the only other to receive positive reviews from critics. Also, Most Friday fans argue whether or not Part 4 or Part 6 is the best of the franchise. Jason Lives features probably the best acting in the whole series, one of the more coherent stories, and a really wicked final sequence. I mean, just look at that shit. Hell yeah! Tommy Jarvis, aka grown-up child Corey Feldman, is after Jason's body, obsessed with confirming his death. In the process, he accidentally reanimates Jason and causes all the events of the movie. I really like that they brought back Tommy Jarvis from the final chapter, because it ended showing him as a child with kind of like PTSD from being attacked by Jason. So part 6, it makes sense that he's out there trying to find Jason and that he's like so bothered by the whole thing. I also think the ending is really cool because not only is chaining Jason to a rock and sending him to the bottom of Crystal Lake very symbolic, it's also a creative way to deal with an enemy that just won't die. Like the final chapter, Jason Lives is fun, gory, and exactly what you want out of a Friday the 13th movie. Now, I know a lot of people like Part 7, but to me, everything went downhill after Part 6. Don't get me wrong, Part 7, The New Blood, it's entertaining, gory, and it does feature a really cool version of Jason wearing his chains from the lake like a real G, but I can just never tell if it's too self-aware or not self-aware enough, and it also features a character with telekinetic powers. So there's that. The last of the original Friday movies came out the following year. Friday Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Just think about the title for a second, okay? He spends 90% of the movie on a boat. I mean, what the After Jason Takes Manhattan brought in the lowest box office revenue of any Friday movie, Paramount Pictures decided to part ways with the franchise. It was another 4 years, the longest gap by 3 years so far, until we saw another Friday movie. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, was released in 1993. Jason Goes to Hell made the same mistake that Friday Part 5 did. It took Jason away. Well, okay, not technically. In this movie, Jason is a disembodied evil spirit that possesses bystanders to do his killing for him. It also tries to shoehorn in a completely bullshit backstory that I am not okay with. Adam Marcus, the director of this movie, and the one responsible for the shoehorned backstory, said in 2019 that Jason is actually a Deadite from the Evil Dead series. And if you know what that means, you know that it's bullshit. There's also this weird subplot of like Voorhees' blood having magical powers that can like defeat the curse of Jason or something. I don't know, it's all ridiculous by this point. But speaking of ridiculous, next up we have Jason X. Jason X takes place in 2455. Why? Okay, I have to admit, these last few movies are still entertaining to watch. Jason Takes Manhattan and The Final Friday both have great kills, and Jason X, admittedly, is hilariously self-aware. But come on, it feels like I've been kidnapped and drugged. Where are we going? What's happening? I don't... Honestly, these movies are just too comedic by this point. That's all. If that's what you expect going into it, I think it would make for a better experience, but don't expect these movies to scare you unless you're really sensitive to, like, super bad gore. The next entry in the Friday franchise is technically also an entry in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, because it's Freddy vs. Jason. Again, this movie is just like an action horror comedy. Like I said in my last video, horror movies at this time were facing an identity crisis, and this movie is a perfect example. However, Freddy vs. Jason is the most profitable Friday movie with a box office return of over 116 million USD. It also really helped Freddy and Jason maintain cultural relevance for several more years, and for that I am grateful. Finally, in 2009, we have the Friday the 13th Reboot. This movie was meant to be a prequel to the whole saga, but ended up becoming a reimagining of the original. If I had to sum up this movie in one sentence, it would be Friday the 13th, but in 2009. That's it. That's it. So now that I've gone through all 12 Friday movies, albeit briefly, it's time to talk about the good and the bad of the franchise, and I'll rank them from most to least quintessentially Friday the 13th. The good of the Friday franchise is that we got an iconic horror figure, a lot of movies, and it helped as a stepping stone in the progression of horror cinema. Many movies that came out following Friday the 13th copied its methods of building and releasing tension. The decent Friday movies are totally bingeable and a top choice if you're looking to just turn your brain off and watch some horror. Plus, Friday the 13th brought a lot of exposure to horror, and the impact of that is immeasurable. The bad of the Friday franchise is, well, some of the movies didn't need to be made, some of the movies would be much better with a little bit more care, and some aspects of any of the movies just did not age well. Like, look, I have a dark sense of humor, and I know that I said a lot of these movies are bad in the good way, but a lot of it is just bad. Like, there's way too much sex and nudity in all of these movies. I understand it's an edgy thing, and it's a legitimate plot device to put characters into vulnerable situations, but it doesn't need to happen that often, and you don't need to see that much of it. And some of the acting is so bad, there's just no excuse. I mean, look, okay, the Friday franchise is full of bad acting, but it's usually good enough to get the job done. But sometimes, it's just bad enough to ruin the movie, but it's not so bad that it becomes funny to watch. So, now that you know where I stand, let's rank them.
So before I get into ranking these movies, I just want to explain briefly what each grade means. So the A tier Friday movies are going to be the movies that are essentially Friday the 13th. They're not only good cinematically, but they also represent everything that Friday has to offer. So Jason's there, he's got his mask, he's killing people, the kills are good, the acting isn't the worst. Yeah, basically just like what you want when you think of a Friday the 13th movie. The B tier movies are going to be ones that are still good movies. I mean, cinematically, they're worth watching, but they just lack something that would otherwise make them iconically Friday the 13th. The C tier movies are going to be like if you took all of the movies and made an average out of all of them. So the acting isn't going to be the best, but it's not going to be the worst. The gore isn't going to be the best, but it's not going to be the worst. I mean, really, like the bulk of what I said is bad in the good kind of way falls into this category. The D tier Friday movies are ones that have more irredeemable features than redeemable features. So these are ones where, you know, the gore isn't enough to save the movie, the acting is bad enough to ruin it, but not so bad that it's funny to watch, but they're not the worst offenders. Because then we have the F tier Friday movies. These are just the worst of the worst Friday movies and are honestly not really even worth watching. All right, so I'm going to start at A and work my way down and give brief explanations for why I give them those rankings. So my first A tier Friday movie is going to be Part 4, the final chapter. I just thought that this movie had everything. It was kind of like playing Friday the 13th bingo. Jason's there, he's got his hockey mask, he's killing people, they look great. It's self-aware enough, the acting isn't that bad, and honestly, like it's just everything that you want when you think of a Friday the 13th movie, which I can also say of my second A tier pick, which is Friday Part 6, Jason Lives. Like I said in my video, I think this Friday movie has the best acting out of all of them. There are some really good shots in this movie as well. It's mostly just a horror movie, but it's pretty fun to watch. I mean, really. Alright, so for my B tier Friday movies, I can pretty well put them up at the same time because it's just Friday Part 1 and Friday Part 2. The reason why I give them this grading is because I feel like they're still cinematically worth watching. I feel like they have twists and turns that are genuinely unexpected. Even though the second movie gets a little bit sleazier for my liking, it's still pretty interesting to watch, and I think they do some creative stuff with filmmaking in those movies, so yeah. Alright, so for my first C tier Friday movie, I'm going to choose Part 7, The New Blood. I think this movie is actually not bad. It's still pretty entertaining and worth watching, but the whole telekinesis thing just completely takes me out of it. Like it's beyond the point of being scary, and it's also past the point of being funny. Well, no, it is actually pretty funny, but it's laughably bad. So it just has to have a C ranking. All right, then up next is Part 3, because Part 3 is actually important if you want to understand the lore of Friday the 13th. It's one of the early ones, and Jason is important. He goes through an important transformation in this movie, but the 3D is so bad. It's so cheap. It's just not worth watching, especially in 2020. Like, it feels so dated. Also, some of the shots of the gore, because they tried to make everything 3D, it's really bad. All right, and then I'm going to put Jason X here because I think this movie it suffers from like 2000s-itis pretty bad, but it is self-aware. It does have some pretty gruesome kills, and
it is actually pretty funny to watch. So like this is one of those movies that's definitely worth watching if you know that it's going to be campy, if you know it's not going to be good, if you're not really looking to get scared. It's pretty self-aware. It makes some good jokes, but again, Uber Jason. It takes place in the future, and it's already kind of falling down the rabbit hole here. So it's a solid C, but a C nonetheless. And then my last pick for the C category of Friday movies is Freddy vs. Jason. Because, again, for much of the same reasons as Jason X and Part 7, it's pretty interesting, or it's pretty entertaining to watch, but don't expect to be scared by it. And also, it's a Nightmare on Elm Street movie. It can't be quintessentially Friday the 13th because it's another series. So, all right. And then for my D movies, I'm just going to throw them up kind of quickly. Jason Goes to Hell, because Jason's like a disembodied spirit, and also I really do not like that the director tried to shoehorn in this new plot of his, so I'm kind of just protesting by putting it in D. Well, I'm not just protesting, it's genuinely that bad. So yeah, it deserves to be there. And then also the remake, because the remake is, if you've never seen a Friday movie before and you watch this like in 2009, you might think like, hey, that was kind of interesting. But I feel like if you're a fan of Jason, the character, this movie feels really weird. And also, it isn't high cinema, So if you're looking for a good movie, you've definitely made the wrong turn watching this one. And then finally, for my F tier Friday movies, it's going to be Part 5 and Part 8. So basically, Part 5, because there is no Jason, the acting is bad. The production of this movie, you can, not just by my opinion, by accounts of people on set, this movie was a nightmare, not just to watch, but to make as well. So it's not a very good Friday movie. There's no Jason. The plot is shitty. So yeah, it's pretty well got nothing going for it. And I can also say that of Jason Takes Manhattan. Most of it takes place on a boat. It's just so ridiculous. The acting is so bad. The editing and the directing, everything is awful. This is like a terabad Friday the 13th movie. So if you're into that kind of thing, definitely watch this. But like if you're looking for even something remotely enjoyable, this ain't it. So yeah, it's definitely like bottom of the list.
And there you have it. Friday the 13th is the second largest horror franchise in the world. It spans 12 movies and 29 years. The rights to the intellectual property of Friday the 13th have been disputed for the last few years, but hopefully we'll see Jason on the big screen again soon enough. Until then, check out some other Friday the 13th movies and let me know what you thought of them in the comments below. Or just get mad at me for how bad my tier list was. Trust me, I love to argue. Well, that's it for now. I'll see you in the next video.